I just want to welcome the wonderful White Balloon, and we've got some amazing speakers as well. Yeah, we've got Dr. Lucy Hone and Faith Holloway, who will both be answering questions throughout this section, and then we will have questions from you. So I think I'm going to hand over to Tracy and Amanda now. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. It's been an amazing few days, and it's wonderful to be a part of lifting the lid again this year. And thank you all for joining us today, for rallying around loss and bereavement support in the workplace. It's lovely to have people from all around the world, and I know how early it is in the morning for many of you, so really appreciate you being here. Thank you. I'm Amanda, and I'm co-founder of White Balloon. I'm here with my colleague and co-founder and sister, Tracy Norris. We're delighted to be joined today by Dr. Lucy Hone, who's an expert in the field of resilient psychology and author of Resilient Grieving, and Faith Holloway, who runs a Compassionate Employers programme for Hospice UK. And she's a frequent speaker about the topic of death and dying in the workplace, and she's written for numerous publications. So one of the reasons we created White Balloon, which is a free online resource for Life End, was really to provide a gentle space to provide information to help people understand what the options are and to empower them to make the right decisions for themselves and for those they love. Whether it's planning a funeral or celebration of life, a difficult time when it can be hard to function, let alone make decisions, or starting gentle conversations ahead of time, and also about where and how to find bereavement support, and really raising awareness of really important topics and conversations. And so it's great to have this opportunity to shine a light on a really important area of bereavement support, which is bereavement in the workplace. I mean, many people spend so much time in the workplace, and as you'll hear from Faith and Lucy, you know, it's really important, and it can have huge implications if they don't feel supported by their employers and by their colleagues. So yeah, we're delighted to have Faith and Lucy here today to share their wisdom and insights and their expertise. I'm going to start with asking Lucy some questions. Lucy is a very dear friend, and so it's lovely to be working together on this, and very excited that Lucy's going to be doing more work in the UK, so that's great. So Lucy, can you start by just telling us a bit about why you got into this field in the first place?
So thanks, Mandy. And thank you everyone for joining us this morning, and wherever you are in the world. I'm coming to you from Aotearoa, New Zealand right now. So it's pretty easy for me, end of the day. And how did I get into this work in the first place? So I have been working in resilient psychology since 2009, when I first started studying resilience at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Some of you might be able to pick that I'm originally from England. I'm from London, but I've been living in New Zealand and I've studied in the States. So I'd done all my resilience research. I had just moved back to New Zealand and was doing my doctoral, my PhD research in psychological well-being and resilience. And on an awful weekend in 2014, my beautiful daughter, 12-year-old Abby, was killed in a tragic road accident alongside her best friend, Ella, who was also 12, and Ella's English mum, Sally, who was a really dear friend of mine. So it's 9.5 years ago, so it's pretty easy for me to talk about it now. But what happened at the time was I was appalled by the pathologizing and victimology of the general resources and approach we were given by the experts who came to help us. We were told, for instance, that we were now prime candidates for divorce, mental illness, and family estrangement in week 1. And I was pretty appalled, really, because I've seen, and I'm so familiar with, all of the research that shows that actually the most common response to all kinds of potentially traumatic events, including bereavement, is actually resilience. And so we have this incredible capacity that resides within us to cope with the most unimaginable losses. And don't get me wrong, it doesn't mean it's fun, pretty, or what you want to do, frankly, but it is possible. And I think what happened for me was that because I was so familiar with all of that research, that I had these ways of thinking and acting that were, even in my completely befuddled brain, were still kind of guiding me and suggesting to me what were the things that I could do that might help. And so I decided, as we do in psychology, to encourage people to be their own experiment. And so I thought I would see how much of this resilient psychology that I was so familiar with, how much of it was actually useful and relevant when it was applied to the bereavement context. Because I started looking in death studies and death internationals, which is the awful names of the peer-reviewed publications, and there was just a complete noticeable absence of all of the findings from my field. So it seemed that people weren't looking at strengths and hope and compassion and gratitude and positive emotions and experiences. That there's a large body of empirical, robust science that says even in the midst of grief, it is still quite common and definitely healthy and helpful to experience positive emotions. So I said about basically creating the field that I call Resilient Grieving, which is applying resilient psychology to the bereavement context. And the first thing I did, I'm a writer really by trade, was I wrote this book that was originally called What Abby Taught Us, because my dear girl did teach us so much, but then became Resilient Grieving. And it's now on its 3rd edition and available globally, and actually about to be sometime next year will be updated in the UK. So we can let you know when that happens.
Lucy, thank you. Thank you for sharing your story with us. And many of us, or many of you will have watched the Lucy's TED Talk, The 3 Secrets of Resilient People, which went viral and helped so many people during COVID. Lucy, what do you think led to its popularity?
And honestly, that's such a bizarre story, because I am, like I say, I'm a writer. I mean, nowadays I do a lot of public speaking, but back then I'd hardly done any. And they asked me to do a TED Talk in 2016. I just said, no way, I really don't make me stand on the stage in front of 1,500 people. And then by 2019, they convinced me into it. But this was pre-COVID, so I don't know, I think like 80,000 people watched it, and I thought that was awesome. And then of course, we went into COVID, and the world went searching tips and tools for resilience. And so I think what has drawn people to it is the fact that in our world we call ourselves pracademics. So we're about taking the best of science out of the ivory towers of academia and making it helpful and useful to people in their everyday lives. So I think it is what appeals to people, and people often say this to me, it's the fact that we all kind of know we want to be resilient, but we don't really know how. And so people say to me, it was the first time I gave them some concrete ways of thinking and acting that they could actually put into their life immediately in a really practical way that clearly they found effective. So that was really, it's been a huge honor and quite the nutty experience, really, to have something like that in your life.
Well, it's amazing talk and very, very inspiring. And Lucy, what sort of support do workplaces typically ask you for?
So the really funny thing about workplaces is that we set up the Institute of Wellbeing and Resilience back in 2017, and we've worked globally with workplaces and education in particular to build resilience and wellbeing at the mass market level. I come from a public health background, and what I'm really driven to do is help people at that really public health, mass market level, work out what helps. So we've been doing all this work in workplaces for years, and somehow even then it still didn't really occur to me to talk to workplaces about the bereaved. So we have created a whole suite of programs supporting the bereaved, but directly. These are online courses and online communities and programs that the bereaved can watch and learn from, but some of them are free and some of them are paid for themselves. But it wasn't till this year that all of our workplace clients that we've been working on wellbeing programs with came to us and said, well, you're the bereaved, you're the grief people too. You have this other program called Coping with Loss, which is basically for the bereaved. Can we have some of that? So people have, essentially a lot of organizations buy my book, Resilient Grieving, in bulk and gift that to their employees. We also run webinars for managers specifically so that they understand what it is they can do to ease people back to work. We don't do that kind of bereavement policy things that, Faith's going to talk about. We are essentially focused on growing grief literacy. So that's what the webinars are for line managers and all staff, and then providing these programs that the bereaved themselves can either purchase, and what we're seeing is that lots of organizations are then paying them back, so they are reimbursing them. Lots of our people who come on our courses then get their organization to pay for it afterwards. And what we hear from the organizations is that they like that because it's a low cost way, low risk way of them doing it. So they don't have to buy lots of programs up front. Some of them do, but lots of them don't. They just do the reimbursement route because that way they are being guided by the bereaved themselves. If the bereaved want to do this program, they're saying, then we'll pick up the tab for that. So that's kind of seems to have, we've sort of stumbled in that in a kind of roundabout way, but that seems to be working really well for the organizations we're working with. And one of our organizations is a massive grocery global brand who is testing our programs globally. So, it's really cool to see workplaces actually realize that so many people are coping with loss in some form or other, and that makes sense to be part of the wellbeing work they do.
Thank you, Lucy. And are there any other, what are the key things you feel, any other things that you feel employers can do to help people cope with loss in the workplace?
So actually in all of our work, because so you have to remember here, we're the Institute of Wellbeing and Resilience. So everything we bring to this party is what can resilience and wellbeing science, how can they help us cope with loss, whether that's on an individual level, a team level, a family level, or even at the kind of macro organizational level. And so one of the things we've been working with our clients for a long time is to build a culture of psychological safety. And that's because lots of people and culture and HR leaders already get the benefits of building a culture of psychological safety. And by that, I mean a culture where you can show up to work, be you feel it's safe to have conversations, to ask for help, to reach out and say, actually, I'm really not coping and I could do with a bit more support. And so we're sort of doing two things. We're building a culture of psychological safety, and we're building grief literacy. So ironically, my PhD was in wellbeing literacy. And it's only reasonably recently, in the last 18 months, that we've started talking more about grief literacy. It's the same but different, but it's this concept that we need. If you have knowledge, then you feel more empowered, more confident, and you are more comfortable with having these conversations.
Thank you, Lucy. And what can colleagues do to help to support each other?
So I know that I'm not going to talk too much about this because I know that's what Faith's really going to be talking about as well. But our kind of checklist goes along the lines of, be patient, be tolerant, understand that grieving any type of coping with loss is almost a job unto itself. So be patient and tolerant. No, there is no timeline. Ask them what they want. Be brave enough to firstly make sure you acknowledge their loss, and don't be put off doing that because it feels awkward, because yeah, guess what? It's awkward. I work with a colleague who says, feel the weird and do it anyway. And I really like that. So we do, in our webinars, we particularly share 6 types of support that people can think about providing, because the first one is emotional, and the second one is kind of practical, and these are the 2 that people intuitively get. But beyond that, there is actually physical support. We had a client recently who offered to go to the parent-teacher evening with one of their workmates because he was suddenly on his own and didn't have, his partner to go with any longer. And I thought that was really amazing. But that was, the kind of physical presence of being there. And then there's informational supports, your knowledge. You might not be the colleague who wants to hug this person, but you might be the colleague who can give them some financial literacy, help them, with, I don't know if they have to sell their house, talk to the real estate people, so there's just so many. Knowledge is really important too. So if you can provide knowledge support, that's good. And then there is memory support. If you knew this person, then be brave enough to say their name and to share your memories, because everyone on this call knows how important that is. And finally, we give a 6 bucket to ongoing support, just to really hammer it home that you need to go the distance with them, and that even when they look like they're sort of done with grieving and that they're all, going well, actually, as we all know, it just comes back usually at the most inconvenient moment. So that's another thing, to make sure that you have a space in the workplace that those of us who are grieving can rush away to if we need to, just to find a bit of kind of private time. So there's just so many practical ways that people can support. And what I love about doing this work is that once they feel like empowered and they've got some more knowledge and ideas, then they feel more confident, and then they get that fantastic feedback loop of seeing the difference that offering compassionate support makes. So it's pretty epic work, actually.
And that's a really good idea about having a space that people can go to. Really important. And is there anything that the bereaved can do to help?
Yeah, there definitely is. So in psychology, there are typical identified thinking traps, which we all fall into. There's, depending on where you look, there's kind of 6 or 8 of them typically. And one of them is, don't expect people to be mind readers. Tell them what you need. And I think when we're working in our courses, our online courses with the bereaved, so we have a live group online course that we run about 2 or 3 times a year with the bereaved, and we do 3 sessions. So one of them is kind of myth busting and sharing contemporary insights on grief. The second session is about emotions and handling that horrendous roller coaster of emotions, but also understanding the power and importance of positive emotions and experiencing them. And then the third one is about relationships, and we always do this big session on actually identifying the barriers for people in telling what you need and asking for what you need. And that is really cool. Just, we get people to read out their kind of plan at the end. It's on Zoom like this, and they say, I'm going to ask Martha to come and help me pack up the house at the weekend, and I'm going to overcome my reticence to do this by, And it's just so cool seeing them actually, when they leave there, they've got one plan to do one thing, and that's always, start small and build up that bravery that you can ask for help. And it doesn't make you beholden, and it doesn't make you weak, and all of this. But people need coaching in that. It's quite amazing.
Brilliant. And Lucy, you touched, thank you for that. You touched on grief timelines. Can you tell us a bit more about grief timelines and how people's needs change over time? Well, that's such a good question. Can I? Because we all have different timelines, don't we? And so that's very important that people understand that.
that there is no set stages or timeline. You know, that's kind of grief 101, isn't it? That there are no 5 stages of grief, that grief is as individual as your fingerprint. And we're always encouraging people to be able to, grieve in their own way, in their own time. But I think it is really important for workplaces to understand that, we can look like we're doing really well and that we've adapted to this loss. And then we just get those awful grief ambushes that kind of come from nowhere. And suddenly, I think I once described it as grief is like a ghoulish game of snakes and ladders. You kind of think you're making progress and suddenly you're slumped down again. So to get people to understand that everybody's timeline is different. And the fact that they suddenly find you, in the broom cupboard at work, weeping away 8 months or 2.5 years later, doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. It just means that you are still grieving, because that it takes so long to relearn to live in the world without that person here. And we just so do need to be patient, don't we? And being flexible is another thing that we work really hard with employers to understand, that here in New Zealand and Australia, we typically, of course, have our summer holidays is, December, January. And we were just working with an organisation recently who were trying to support a particularly very high up, one of their senior leaders. And actually he had said, most people down here take like until the 3rd week of January off. And he said, actually, I really would quite like to come into the office in the beginning, earlier in January, because it will be quiet and I can get stuff done. But also my summer holiday is just smashed apart. It's not, I don't want to sit on the beach pretending everything's okay. So I'd rather come in, get some good work done, and then take time off, take those days later in the year. And they worked really closely with him to let that happen. And I thought that was pretty cool.
Well, Lucy, thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom and insights. I'm sure everyone's got lots of questions, but I think we'll do questions at the end.
Lucy, well, thank you for asking me on. We believe always in that two-way growth, and learning. We're all learning from each other. So it's really cool for me to be here.
No, well, thank you for being here, and it's really insightful. Thank you very much. And we're going to look forward to hearing from Faith now. And I think Tracy's going to run through some questions with Faith. Faith, thank you for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Faith, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Apart from the other wonderful work that Hospice UK do, the Compassionate Employers programme has been running since 2019. Can you tell us a little bit about why Hospice UK started that, you got involved, and what progress you've seen over the last few years, because it's been running for a few years now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. It's funny, you'll hear when I start talking that I'm a Kiwi as well, but I'm the opposite of Lucy. So started in New Zealand and now in London. So it's funny that we both ended up on this call together. So Compassionate Employers started in 2019. I wasn't around when it first started. I joined 2 years ago now. But the reason that we created it initially was that we realised it was kind of a win-win for us. There was a need for organisations to have the skills and support of end-of-life care in the workplace. I think a lot of organisations, like Lucy has already talked about, kind of recognise that need for support, but just had no idea where to start. And we're Hospice UK. We support all the hospices around the United Kingdom. So we felt like we had that skill set. We knew what death and dying looked like. We knew what support people needed and how to, we wanted to experiment with translating that into the workplace. So it felt like a kind of win-win for us. And we're always very transparent around the fact that we are a charity and we need to raise funds. So it felt like a way for us to support organisations, get in there, give them the support they need, but also raise money for our hospices. This year alone, we're in a deficit hospices nationwide of £186 million. So that's on top of the additional funding that we already have to raise just to keep hospices open, keep beds open, keep the lights on. So it was really important for us to come up with fundraising initiatives that supported our communities, helped people, got the word out about death and dying, but also generated income for us, if I'm being completely kind of transparent with that. And in terms of the impact we've seen, so when I first joined, it was just a handful of employers. I mean, that was just on the kind of cusp of COVID. I think we were kind of in the middle of the second lockdown. So a lot of death and dying was happening and we had a lot of excess deaths, but if I'm honest, it's been interesting. People have often said to me, did you feel like COVID made a massive shift? I haven't, if I'm completely honest. In my work, I thought there would be more of a shift than there was. And I think it raised awareness levels, but not necessarily always the support that comes with that. I think people are still very stuck and confused about what they should be doing. So we started with a handful of employees. We've definitely seen the growth. We're now supporting over 100,000 employees, some of the biggest employers in the UK, which is amazing. So there's definitely that need and people are acknowledging it, but we still have a long way to go. And we still want, the ideal would be every single employer in the UK and internationally being a compassionate employer, right? So we're seeing the growth and we're seeing the need is still there, but definitely a long way to go in terms of educating people on why they need to do that and why they should.
Yeah, and part of that, should that be policy change? One of the most requested forms of support is flexibility in bereavement leave. What does good bereavement leave policy look like for an employer?
Good bereavement policy, first and foremost, that it exists, because it doesn't always in organisations. And I think organisations are still kind of realising that they should have a separate bereavement policy or a specific policy that looks at bereavement. We often find it kind of lumped in with other policies or just kind of a small kind of footnote on a compassionate leave policy. And if you think about any of us, I'm sure most of us on this call have experienced a bereavement, and that's why we're here today. To have your bereavement reduced to a footnote or a kind of asterisk on a policy is incredibly kind of demoralising and patronising, I think, to see that. So even just having a dedicated policy is a massive start. When you do create that policy, having it being led by employees, so not just having a kind of stock standard generic. I know templates can be very helpful as a starting point, but I would definitely encourage people to personalise that to their organisation. Lead from employees. Don't just have a number of days because you've read it on the internet or someone's told you to do that amount of days. Actually talk to your employees and have it led by them in terms of what they need from you. We've already touched a little bit on flexibility and compassion. I think that's huge. So some of the things we encourage people to have in their policies are things like pre-bereavement leave. We work in the hospice world. We know that sometimes we are given warning if someone is dying or in their last stages of their life. So let people take that pre-bereavement leave to spend with their loved one before they have died, when they still have time to be with them and say the things that they need to say to them, or just connect as a family with the person who is dying. But then also we want to see that compassion and that flexibility kick in afterwards and long term as well. So Lucy's just shared that incredible example of someone wanting to not take their full time in the summer holidays because they're sitting on a beach and kind of contemplating the scale of the loss that they've just experienced. And I think that's the same for a lot of people. They may want to come back to work quite quickly and have that respite from their grief or that distraction from their grief. But then later down the line, when things kind of kick in, or maybe there's time they want to spend with their children or their family, or it's a person's birthday, or there's religious holidays, can that kick in, 6-12 months down the line? I think we put this quite restrictive timeline on it, which is you take the time off for the funeral when the person first dies, and then, if you're lucky, you take 2 weeks. Most people only get about 3 to 5 days, and then you're expected to be back at work as normal. And it's, what does that even look like or mean to be back at work as normal? We see a lot of unnecessary restrictions, I think, around when it can be taken, but also who it can be taken for. So I think that's still a really, I want to say, quite archaic way to look at bereavement. So it's kind of, they have to be an immediate family member, they have to be a blood relative. It's 2023, people don't have traditional family structures, people have chosen families. So I think we're trying to do away with that a little bit, recognise that people live in multi-generational households, people live in households with people they're not related to. So why are we still telling people it has to be your parent or your partner or your child? So we're trying to do away with that as well. And then I guess some other things that I've just noticed, I read a lot of bereavement policies, and it's really interesting sometimes the tone of policies and how clinical they can seem. Something we ask people to do, I've said it on lots of different webinars and when I've gone through policies with people, is just read your policy out loud from start to finish. If you don't want to read it out loud because it's incredibly long, that probably tells you something about it being too long and other people not wanting to read it as well. So read it out loud from start to finish. Imagine a line manager reading it because their team member has just been bereaved, or imagine a bereaved person reading it as well. And imagine what it feels like if someone that you love has just died and then you read this policy that's incredibly restrictive, confusing, quite harsh in the language. I've seen examples, I'm not even exaggerating, I've read a policy not so long ago where they had written, you know, if one of your children dies, you get this amount of leave. If two of your children dies, you get this amount of leave. If more than two of your children die, please get in touch with us and we'll discuss what happens. And you just look at a policy like that and think, who wrote that? And what mindset? And also, what do they expect someone to think when they're reading that as a bereaved parent or as anyone who's bereaved? It was just, yeah, horrific. So read your policy, think about the tone of it. When in doubt, write it as if you would say it to a person, because that's how they're going to interpret it when they read it to themselves. They'll hear it in their own voice, and it's an incredibly harsh voice to hear when you're bereaved. And don't be afraid to sound human. An example that I really like, one of our members, the Co-op Group, which is a UK-based organisation, but if you go online, they have all of their policies open to the public, which I imagine is international. And their bereavement policy just reads so nicely. It's incredibly kind of warm and, you know, chatty and quite conversational. So I definitely think the tone is really important as well. And then I guess kind of some aftercare of it as well. Your bereavement policy should be a living, breathing document. So it should be based on employees. You should be getting feedback from them. The signposting should be regularly updated. Make sure it's geographically diverse. I think in the UK, we're very England, London centric. So make sure you have bereavement support in Scotland and Wales and Ireland and, you know, all over the UK as well. I think that's all about. I've kind of waffled on for a bit, but there's a lot about policies. I could do a whole thing just on policies, but yeah, policies are incredibly interesting.
But I think it makes us all realise businesses have a long way to go, don't they, to get their policies in place and to be really supportive, and how broad it is. So really interesting. I think the other thing is also for colleagues, talking about bereavement in the workplace is very difficult. And I think, is it partly because bereavement is seen as quite a private, personal thing, but we're sort of moving it into the public sphere? What are your thoughts about talking about death and dying in the workplace and encouraging people to do that, and how you do that, making people comfortable talking about it, really?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love for those who want to talk about death and dying in the workplace to feel comfortable, but I would caveat it with a little bit of a caution that I often feel, especially in the kind of mental health and bereavement space, which is this idea that we should all be bringing everything to work and be talking about everything that's happening in our lives in the workplace. And I think recognizing that there's lots of different reasons that people won't do that, and it's not necessarily always because of stigma or because there's these kind of invisible barriers that prevent them from doing it. There's also a lot of cultural factors that go into why people don't talk about bereavement in the workplace. There's personal factors, you know, maybe just their personality is that they're not someone that shares a lot of things at work, whether that's bereavement, whether it's their relationship, whether it's their kids. So I think sometimes we can do people a bit of a disservice by saying, you know, you're not sharing your bereavement with me, so you're being secretive, or you're not being yourself, or you're not being vulnerable enough. And I think that's quite harsh, especially on someone that's just experienced a bereavement. So I'd maybe caution workplaces from thinking that everyone needs to share their bereavement. I think where I have an issue with it, and where most of us have an issue with it, is people that want to share it but can't. So I think we should be focusing on those people. But the people who just genuinely don't want to share their bereavement with their employer beyond, I need some time off, or I need to go pick up my kids from school because the person who used to pick them up has died. So yeah, I guess I would just be a little bit cautious around that. I think we definitely need to change the culture of it, but I think sometimes we push people to a point that maybe they're not comfortable with because we think everyone should be reacting the same. And I think the main thing that Lucy said, and which I will echo, is everyone is so different. So recognize the difference between I'm uncomfortable sharing this because you haven't created a culture where I can share my personal life with you, versus you have created that culture, but I'm not taking the option, and please respect my wishes and stop asking me to share something I don't want to share. And I think those are two very different things.
And I suppose that's what makes it difficult, because colleagues often want to help but don't know how, and are worried about pushing someone into saying something they don't want to, or sharing their grief. Have you seen organisations successfully address this by educating employees and encouraging them to maybe approach the subject in one way and not another?
Yeah, I think addressing it in the workplace, getting people to talk about it more is interesting. I think a lot of it comes from awareness. I think the most common thing I hear from people, I have to wonder how I say this without sounding too harsh, because I get very kind of passionate on the behalf of bereaved people, is I think we need to do away with this idea that you get brownie points for thinking about helping someone or feeling sorry for someone, because that's the thing I most often hear is, well, I did really want to help them, or I did really want to reach out, or I was thinking of them, I wasn't just ignorant or indifferent. I did really care about them and want to say something, but I just didn't know what to say. And I think we need to move away from accepting that as a bit of an excuse. I think maybe that sounds quite harsh, but I hear it a lot, and I just wonder what I was saying, like, oh no, I get that you wanted to do something, but you didn't. I think Lucy said, that kind of feeling the weird and doing it anyway, or feeling the discomfort and just powering through. We need to be encouraging people to be a bit braver than they currently are, because it's leaving bereaved people behind. And it's not just bereavement, it's a whole kind of slew of topics where people say, oh, I want to say something, but I didn't. Without being too harsh on the people that are doing that, I think that's often a huge reflection of culture. And if we're looking at culture, I think sometimes we start with the big kind of scary topics, which I use in quotations because I don't think they inherently are, but we've created them that way now. So we need to unpick that a bit. Things like mental health, bereavement, the menopause, infertility, all of these things that we see workplaces tackling. But I think starting at that point is a little bit misguided, and we almost need to break that down to be a bit more digestible. So what we encourage organisations to do is start with topics that are easier for people to talk about. So I encourage people, start with things that are smaller, things like in a team meeting, rather than saying, oh yeah, I had a good weekend. If you had a crap weekend, starting by saying that. You don't need to share what the details are, but even creating that culture of we actually can say if things have gone badly. When you do your team meetings, talk about things that have gone wrong, as well as just, not just celebrating the things that have gone really well. And you'll start to, in kind of micro doses, infuse that vulnerability, so that when someone is bereaved, or when someone is going through a mental health crisis, or when someone experiences any form of loss, you've kind of built those small kind of steps to that place, rather than asking someone to like climb a mountain at a time where they're going through something really difficult. So I think it starts by smaller steps. Don't start with grief and then expect people to make that leap. Start with smaller things that happen on a more day-to-day basis. And then you'll have that culture in place when you need it for people to share.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. And I think you've had a lot of conversations with bereaved employees. I think it's that initial approach and conversation that's difficult. Have you got any tips for colleagues of someone who's bereaved, how to start and initiate that conversation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of it starts before we even have the conversation, which is changing our mindset around it. Because I think people have a massive barrier to this conversation because they've built it up into something that it doesn't necessarily need to be, or they feel that the reason most of us don't do anything is because our desire to do something is kind of outmatched by the skills that we perceive that we have. And I think that's really interesting, because the skill you need the most in these conversations is just being able to listen and connect with another human being. And if none of us were capable of doing that, we wouldn't exist as humans. We would just all be living by ourselves. We wouldn't have workplaces, we wouldn't have places where people came together. So the fact that you even are employed and in a workplace and have a family and connections, and is proof that you can connect with other people. So I think people really kind of sell themselves short in terms of how capable they are to have these conversations. So I think a lot of it is that mindset. If you go into it thinking, which a lot of people do, I need to have the perfect thing to say, I need to fix this person, I need to make the situation better, I need to leave them with, imparting some kind of wisdom that they feel they have. And I often say, and I've said it on other kind of sessions before, if people focus more on listening, which no one does. People always say to me, what should I say? This, what's the script? What's the perfect thing to say? And I always say to them, well, I can't tell you that. I don't know the situation. I don't know the bereavement. I don't know what's happened to the person. But I can encourage you to listen to them and be a human being and accept that you can't do anything or kind of change the situation. So I think the talking bit is actually the smallest part of the equation, which is just acknowledge, as we've already talked about, acknowledge what has happened, share the information that you've been given. So, I heard through John, our manager, that you've been on bereavement leave. I'm so sorry to hear that's happened, and I hope you're doing okay and that you feel you can talk to me if you want to. That should be a very kind of simple part of it, which is just acknowledging what has happened. And that can be clumsy, it can be awkward, it might feel a little bit awkward at times, or, it might be a little bit uncomfortable at first. But then the main part of it should just be being curious about the person. So, asking questions about how they're doing. Do you have any support in place? How are you feeling being back at work? Do you feel well supported? Is there anything that I can be doing differently or better to help you be back at work? just be curious and be open to those answers rather than kind of always feeling like you have to be saying something. I think if we listened more and stopped talking a little bit more, then we'd actually have better conversations with people who have grieved.
Very true. Well, thank you, Faith. And we've enjoyed listening to you today and talking to you. I think we're going to wrap the questions up there and take questions from the people who've joined us today. So I think, Victoria, are you going to run through some of the questions?
I know that Dr. Lucy has already seen the one as well from Claire. So I don't know if shall I read it out anyway? Claire Turner's asking, as you said, it's important to build on what's gone well so far. Very general question, but how do you think in general, employers' approach to build resilience and supporting grief has changed over the past 10 years? And what has been the most significant improvement?
So it's such a good question, Claire. And I can tell you that employers are much more ready to approach resilience than they are grief. You know, there are definitely some forward-thinking employers that we work with who are, as I say, you know, are coming to us now to say, actually, talk to us about grief. But we have so much work as providers of resilience training and resilience programs. I mean, the appetite for resilience is huge, and that definitely was exacerbated and kind of accelerated by COVID. So I just last week I was in Australia with engineers, and they were all health and safety engineers. So the fact that they're there and they've asked me to come and talk about resilience and wellbeing is nothing short of flabbergasting. And I remember about 5 or 6 years ago being with aerospace engineers, and they were doing the full, you know, like this to me. It's like, oh, how annoying, the wellbeing woman's here. How can we get out of here faster? And really, the environment has completely changed. And the Great Resignation did lots of that employers have really woken up to the fact that they need to be an employer of choice. And the younger generation coming through, you know, are able to. In fact, I was at a conference this morning saying that and this was an HR remuneration conference, and they were saying that probably the balance of power has completely shifted towards young people, and yay, isn't that awesome? So there has been a massive shift. Certainly psychological safety is such a hot topic that we're always being asked about. My observation also is that all employers want their staff to be resilient and avoid burnout. They're not necessarily ready to acknowledge the responsibility that they play at an organizational level in this, you know, dance. So that is really interesting. We get a lot of people saying to us, will you come and do resilience training with our organization because our young people are really non-resilient? I mean, that is a classic question that we get asked. So we kind of do a little bit of slapping and say to them, and we will come and do some resilience training, but you need to understand, even we accept that you can't necessarily change the entire organizational practices, but actually one of the things we've really learned in the last 5 years is the most potent lever of change is at the team level. So we often focus most of our training on teams. You know, you can't change everything. You can't change HR policy unless you know you have that influence. But what can you do in your team today? And we do a lot of work around tiny noticeable things. You know, like really say thank you to people more often than you probably do. Acknowledge their contribution. You know, make sure it's good to be, Denise's mantra is, it's better to be kind than right. So, you know, there's definitely an appetite, I'm really pleased to say, for that kind of thing. Anyway, I haven't waffled on too much. Somebody else asked a question.
There's another question actually from Claire. It's for both of you. So I don't know if, Faith, you wanted to answer this first, but let me read it out and then you can jump in. You've both touched on it, but what are your thoughts on employers or organisations' way of supporting the grief, loss and diagnosis before it happens? And then just clarified, building resilience, we know that most likely all of us will experience that ourselves or of our close colleagues in the workplace. And then they're saying, I completely agree that culture is the strong part, but employers often need something more structured. So I don't know, Faith, if you wanted to.
Sure. Yeah. So compassionate employers, I guess one of our differentiators amongst the market, especially here in the UK, is that we have a more kind of holistic approach to end of life care. So we focus on bereavement and we support employees through bereavement, but we kind of like to think we look at the whole cycle. Being Hospice UK and being an end of life care, we think about support. You know, if someone's caring for someone who's terminally ill, if they receive a terminal diagnosis themselves. So we're looking at kind of whole end of life cycle. And I think that's really important. And it's one of the things that organizations often overlook is they don't have a process in place. They have a process in place for when someone, sometimes when someone dies in an organization, so a death and service guide, and they have a bereavement policy, but there's no support pre that. And often they exist in silos. So they might have a carers network and they might have sometimes a grief network. It's quite rare, but we are seeing it happen more often. But there's no joining up of that support. So that's kind of what we're hoping to tackle, which is, you know, not just training managers in bereavement, but also training them in how to support carers and also training them in how to support someone if they just receive a diagnosis and they come back to work, which happens more often than not. So I think what employers can do to address that is oftentimes they'll have the support in different pockets and finding a way to join up that support so that when someone receives a diagnosis themselves or when someone they love receives a diagnosis at work, they're not kind of constantly scrambling to find support and information in all these different places. There's a connected approach, and that's through something like the structure that we have where all the information is in the same place. So if, like, we had a situation when I first joined, which was very unfortunate, but someone was caring for their husband who'd received a cancer diagnosis. The cancer diagnosis was not great in terms of the prognosis. The husband died very soon after, about 2 or 3 months into the person caring for them, and then they were kind of in the bereavement stage of their journey of getting support from the organisation. But because we had this connected approach, the manager had been trained on all forms of support and could kind of go between those on the journey with the person, and the support that they received going into our members hub was all in the same place. So I'd encourage people to think about that, like how are you connecting that support so it's not this constant kind of chase of, oh, when I'm not a carer anymore, I'm bereaved, so what does that mean? Or I've received a terminal diagnosis, but I'm not ready to leave work, or I'm not dying yet. So what happens before that process? So that would be my advice, I guess, in a nutshell, is to link it up. But I don't know what Lucy thinks.
We don't do, we don't work in the anticipatory grief space, but all I can offer is that we always encourage, particularly managers, to really know about their EAP policy and what their EAP therapists, counsellors are actually offering. So, you know, and the organisations that we work with are providing more employee assistance more broadly. So I think, in fact, just at this conference this morning, I asked these HR professionals how many of them knew what was available in terms of EAP, and they didn't seem to know much. You know, it's just basically like, oh, we've got EAP, it's that bucket, we can shove people in that direction. And I thought that was really interesting, because as EAP has become more sophisticated and is providing a broader service, you know, I want managers to know whether they're supplying ACT, whether they're doing CBT, whether there's financial counselling, whether there are death doula. You know, wouldn't it be great if they knew what was available rather than just going, oh, you can go and talk to EAP, because that's not really good enough.
Lucy, just quickly, what is EAP?
Oh, sorry. Employee assistance programs. What do you call them then over there, Faith? Do you know what you call them?
Yeah, it's the same. I think it's just the acronym that's tripping people up. If they haven't heard the acronym.
So most big organizations have EAP for kind of, you know, for people who really do want free counseling, normally 6 sessions, and it's confidential and it's never discussed back with the employer. You get these free 6 sessions. And it's definitely being taken up much more globally by employees. They're learning to have trust in it. And I think it is improving to the service.
Fantastic, thank you. And there's a question from Catherine. What are your thoughts on the kind, this is for both of you, so whoever wants to jump in, what are your thoughts on the kind of support businesses can put in place to support people working within death care?
I can just quickly say that we have worked with aged care providers, and they have had us come in and train their staff on a voluntary basis. So you train those staff who turn up, which is normally ends up being quite a small proportion, because when you're working in any kind of healthcare, there's that awful tension between what is urgent and what is important. And so it's just so hard to leave caring for someone to go and have your, grief training or resilience training when it's just not urgent, and they're always short of nurses, is the terrible bottom line on that.
Yeah, so I think similarly, I kind of shared an open workshop that we've actually just started. We had the first one of them in October, and we have another cohort in February, which was supporting hospice staff, NHS staff, midwives, people that kind of experience a high rate of professional grief in their roles. And that's been really interesting. I think we've had similar challenges where, if you work in an emergency department or in a hospice, you don't necessarily always have the time or the ability. We have people come on these sessions and they say, I'm sorry, the alarm's just gone off, I'm going to have to leave. So it's an interesting challenge for us. How do we reach those people that really need our support? And I think if anyone works in those sectors, something I would just ask you to think about in terms of how you support your people is we do a kind of a pre and a post survey with everyone that comes on our workshops. And we always ask, particularly the coping with professional grief, have you ever had support on this? And I'm yet to have someone who has ever received kind of adequate bereavement support, despite working in a hospice or the NHS or a role that experiences a huge rate of kind of death and dying in their role. So don't leave those people behind. I think there's a massive assumption that if you work in death and dying, you know how to deal with it on a personal level. But even I was just talking to a kind of palliative care nurse who had very recently trained. She was very young and just started working one of our hospices. And I said, surely in 2023, they're doing bereavement support in your courses. And she said, there's literally nothing. There's no module on how we cope with bereavement ourselves. It's all about the families. So I would love to tackle that next, organisations, and then our national healthcare system and our training system, because we're doing them such a disservice.
I think Claire saying one last question.
It's actually a question from my husband. He wanted to know, and if an employer needed to know and do two things that would help support grief in the workplace, what would those single two things be?
Who wants to take that? Do you want to go first, Lucy?
So I want to say have a bereavement policy, so I'm trying not to say that so that Faith says it, because that's yours, not mine.
I probably would have said that as well. I think, echoing what you've said, Lucy, I think the thing around the teams is really interesting. So I'd almost want to say, if we're going to have two, if for some reason we're restricted by two, then I'd say something at the kind of really kind of macro level and something at the micro level. So macro would probably be having a really flexible, compassionate policy that's organisation-wide that applies to everyone. But then we did some interesting research recently that looked at, who's the first person that people go to when they're bereaved. Everyone thought it was HR. It was only 6% of people went to HR. And an overwhelming amount, 3/4 of people said they'll go to their line manager. So I think that's incredibly interesting that we invest so much of our resource and our support in HR teams, but actually it's the manager that's going to be the first person that represents your organisation. And if they get it wrong, which unfortunately some of them do, because there's a huge range of managers, there's some great managers, there's some people that have ended up in management positions that don't have kind of the people skills or the emotional intelligence to support someone through a bereavement. So I would say then focus on something like line management training, consistent training, not just kind of a one-off thing, and think about what Lucy's mentioned around team culture. So what's your team going to do when you're bereaved? How are they going to welcome you back to work, and how are they going to support you going forward?
And I'm just going to add to that. The other thing I really want people to know is that approximately 15% of the population will experience prolonged grief disorder. So that means that 85% of the working population who are navigating grief will get through using very ordinary processes and the help of their friends and family and co-workers. So I think it's truly important to empower those people to know that they can be what we call expert companions. And by that, we just mean going the distance, being there for them, but believing that your everyday conversations and listening, that as we've both said, listening again and again and again is the most powerful support you can give people. And so I see we get an awful lot of emails in our inboxes saying, so-and-so's lost their husband. I'm really worried about the teenagers. Can you recommend a therapist? And actually, we're always going back to them and saying, is there a particular reason you think they need a therapist? Because actually, most people will get through it using their, internal, external, immediate support systems. And as I've said before, that doesn't mean it's easier and it's not fun and it's not pretty, it's bloody awful. But actually, we are hardwired to cope with loss. And I think it's really important for all of us who are working in this field to keep that messaging clear as well, to give people hope and belief that they can get through it without necessarily needing medical or professional help. If they do, of course, that's completely fine, but not to rush everybody in that direction.
No, Lucy's got to leave. And Faye from Hospice UK, thank you so much for finishing the festival with such a vitally important subject. Found it really helpful, really, really useful.
I just say very quickly to thank you to Lucy and Faith for your time today. It's been so insightful and you've lots to think about. It's such an important subject, and thank you for being here and sharing with us. And thank you to Jo and Victoria. It's the last session of Lifting the Lid, and we feel honoured to be a part of it. So thank you to you guys too. So
thank you.